May 1945. The entire world was celebrating the official end of the Second World War. In Times Square, people were kissing in the streets. In London, the bells of Westminster Abbey rang out over a city that had survived the Blitz. The Nazi regime had been completely, utterly annihilated, crushed between the massive industrial might of the United States Army in the West and the staggering, brutal wave of the Soviet Red Army in the East. But deep in the shattered, ash-covered ruins of Germany and Czechoslovakia, the commanding general of the United States Third Army, George S. Patton, was not celebrating. While the rest of the world naively believed that the nightmare of global conflict was finally over, Patton realized with absolute, terrifying clarity that a new, infinitely more dangerous war had already begun. And it was starting with a massive, highly classified hostage crisis that the polite, sanitized history books have spent the last 80 years desperately trying to hide. As the Soviet Red Army relentlessly bulldozed its way through Eastern Europe and into Germany, they didn't just liberate Nazi concentration camps. They also overran dozens of Stalags, the German prisoner of war camps holding tens of thousands of captured American and British soldiers. Under the standard, civilized rules of international warfare, these liberated Allied troops should have been immediately fed, treated, and sent directly back to the American lines. But Joseph Stalin was not a civilized leader, and the Soviet Union did not play by the rules of the Geneva Convention. Stalin looked at these thousands of starving, exhausted American boys and didn't see allies to be rescued. He saw ultimate geopolitical leverage. The Soviet military machine simply locked the gates, surrounded the camps with heavily armed Red Army guards, and refused to let the Americans go. Stalin was effectively holding thousands of United States soldiers completely hostage, using them as human bargaining chips to force the United States and Britain to hand over Soviet defectors and surrender critical post-war territories. If the Western Allies refused to comply, the unspoken, terrifying threat hanging in the freezing European air was that these thousands of American heroes would quietly disappear into the frozen hell of the Siberian Gulags. A slow, agonizing, completely undocumented execution. Before we rip the absolute lid off of what General Patton did when he uncovered this massive Soviet betrayal, I need you to do something. If you want the raw, unfiltered, and deeply uncomfortable history that the politicians and the textbooks are terrified to print, hit that subscribe button right now. We do not do soft, politically correct summaries on this channel. We look directly at the brutal, unrelenting realities of the past and the uncompromising men who had to make impossible choices. Type the word betrayal in the comments right now if you are ready to see exactly what happens when the Soviet Union threatens the lives of American boys, and George S. Patton decides that the only proper response to a hostage crisis is to start World War III. The intelligence reports began flooding into the Third Army headquarters, and they were absolutely chilling. American liaison officers who had been sent into Soviet-controlled territory to arrange the peaceful transfer of the liberated POWs were being held at gunpoint, aggressively blocked, and in some cases, openly fired upon by Soviet troops. Tens of thousands of American men were unaccounted for in the Soviet zones. Stories were leaking out of American prisoners being forced onto freezing cattle cars, heading not west toward freedom, but east, deep into the dark, impenetrable heart of the Soviet Union. When Patton read these reports, his legendary volcanic temper did not explode into yelling. It turned completely, terrifyingly cold. Patton had spent his entire life studying the brutal psychology of warfare. He understood instantly that the Soviets were not acting like an Allied army. They were acting like a conquering empire that had just found its next victim. He famously wrote in his private diaries, which were heavily censored for years, that the United States had fought the wrong enemy, that they had just defeated a rabid dog only to allow an absolute monster to take over half of the civilized world. Patton demanded immediate, aggressive action. He knew that the only language the Soviet High Command respected was overwhelming, unapologetic force. During a highly tense, heavily guarded diplomatic banquet following the German surrender, Patton found himself face-to-face with the supreme commanders of the Soviet military apparatus, including the legendary ruthless Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating. The Soviets were arrogant, dripping with medals, drinking heavy vodka, and radiating the supreme confidence of an army of millions that currently occupied half of Europe. They expected the Americans to play the polite role of diplomats. They fundamentally misunderstood the psychology of George S. Patton. When the Soviet generals attempted to aggressively toast their dominance and brush off American concerns regarding the exact whereabouts of the trapped Allied POWs, Patton completely refused to play the political game. Through his interpreter, he looked directly at the Soviet High Command, with eyes that one aide described as pure, freezing steel, and delivered a message that sent a shockwave through the entire room. He let them know in no uncertain terms that he considered the Soviet military to be a disorganized, undisciplined mob. He made it violently clear that he was not intimidated by their numbers and that he knew exactly what they were doing with the American boys trapped behind their lines. But Patton didn't just stop at insults. He formulated a strategic plan so incredibly audacious, so historically dangerous, that it terrified the Allied High Command more than it terrified the Russians. Patton looked at his massive, highly disciplined, combat-hardened Third Army. He looked at the vast stockpiles of captured German weapons, tanks, and ammunition. And he looked at the 2 million surrendered German soldiers sitting in temporary holding camps. Patton sent a highly classified, explosive message up the chain of command to General Dwight D. Eisenhower and the politicians in Washington. His proposal was simple, brutal, and entirely serious. He demanded that the United States military immediately halt the demobilization of its troops. He requested permission to secretly rearm several divisions of the surrendered German Wehrmacht, putting American commanders in charge of German combat veterans, and use this massive combined superpower army to instantly launch a devastating unannounced surprise attack directly into the teeth of the Soviet Red Army. Patton wanted to violently smash through the Soviet lines, physically liberate the thousands of American POWs being held hostage in Eastern Europe, and drive the Red Army all the way back to the borders of Russia before they had time to solidify their iron grip on the continent. Type the word attack in the comments if you are sitting there realizing that General Patton was entirely willing to kick off the Third World War right then and there to save his men. Because I want to know how many of you understand the absolute magnitude of what was happening in those command tents. Patton wasn't crazy. He was terrifyingly prophetic. He argued passionately that a massive confrontation with the Soviet Union was completely inevitable. He insisted that the United States possessed a massive tactical advantage at that exact moment. America had the atomic bomb, a fully mobilized, undefeated mechanized army, and the logistical capability to supply it. The Soviets were severely battered, bleeding, and relying heavily on American Lend-Lease trucks and supplies to even keep their army moving. Patton explicitly warned that if the United States backed down, abandoned those trapped POWs, and allowed Stalin to control Eastern Europe, the world would suffer through a terrifying, decades-long Cold War that would threaten the very existence of humanity. He warned that millions of people would be enslaved behind an iron curtain, and that the blood of the American boys left behind in Soviet hands would permanently stain the conscience of the United States. He literally begged for the order to attack, famously stating, "I'll make it look like they started it if you want." But the politicians in Washington and the diplomatic generals like Eisenhower were completely horrified by Patton's raw, uncompromising aggression. The American public was exhausted by years of total war. They wanted their boys to come home. They did not want to immediately launch into a catastrophic, apocalyptic ground war against the massive Soviet empire. The politicians believed that Stalin was a rational actor who could be reasoned with at the negotiating tables in Yalta and Potsdam. They ordered General Patton to immediately stand down, to bite his tongue, and to cease all aggressive posturing toward the Soviet Union. They completely silenced their most effective, most brilliant battlefield commander for the sake of political optics. And in doing so, they sealed the horrific fate of thousands of men. Because Patton was forced to halt his advance, and because the Allied forces actively retreated from strategic positions in Czechoslovakia to allow the Soviets to take over the occupation zones, the leverage was entirely lost. While official military records remain notoriously murky, incomplete, and highly classified regarding this specific betrayal, independent historical researchers and POW advocacy groups estimate that thousands of American troops who fell into Soviet hands at the end of the Second World War were never, ever returned. They became the first tragic, forgotten casualties of the Cold War. They were quietly shipped off to the horrific, freezing labor camps of the Siberian Gulag network, where they were worked to death in uranium mines and logging camps, completely abandoned by the country they had sworn to serve, sacrificed on the altar of geopolitical appeasement. Patton was eventually relieved of his command of the beloved Third Army, essentially fired by Eisenhower for his refusal to play the political game and his unrelenting vocal hatred for the Soviet appeasement strategy. He was relegated to a meaningless, paper-pushing command, his brilliant military mind essentially locked in a cage by a government that was terrified of his honesty. In December of 1945, just months after he had desperately tried to launch a rescue mission to save those thousands of trapped American boys, George S. Patton died following a highly suspicious, completely bizarre low-speed automobile accident in Germany. The fact that the man who wanted to completely destroy the Soviet Union died so suddenly, just as the Cold War was beginning, has fueled intense, unyielding historical debate and assassination theories for over 80 years. But the ultimate heartbreaking truth of this story isn't about how Patton died. It's about what he was willing to do while he lived. When confronted with the horrific reality that thousands of American soldiers were being held hostage and threatened with a slow, freezing execution by an evil empire, George S. Patton didn't call for a diplomatic summit. He didn't write a strongly worded letter of protest to the United Nations. He looked at the map, he loaded his revolvers, and he asked for the green light to burn the Soviet Empire to the ground to bring his boys home. He was a deeply flawed, incredibly complicated, and profoundly violent man, but his loyalty to the American soldier was absolute and unbreakable. History has ultimately proven George S. Patton entirely, completely right. The appeasement of Joseph Stalin did not bring global peace. It brought 45 years of nuclear terror, proxy wars, the Berlin Wall, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the agonizing suffering of millions of human beings trapped behind the Iron Curtain. If Patton had been unleashed in the spring of 1945, the entire landscape of the modern world would look completely different. But he was silenced, and the thousands of forgotten American POWs who slowly starved to death in the frozen wastelands of Siberia paid the ultimate terrifying price for that silence. This is the hardest, most devastating reality of military history. It forces us to ask a question that most people are completely terrified to answer. I want you to go directly into the comments right now and give me your absolutely honest verdict. If you had been the Supreme Allied Commander in 1945, and you knew that Stalin was holding 5,000 of your men hostage in the Gulags, would you have given General Patton the order to attack? Type the word unleash if you would have armed the Third Army and started World War III to get them back, or type the word peace if you believe that avoiding another global conflict was worth the sacrifice of those men. Make your choice, because that is the exact agonizing burden of command. Hit that like button right now to honor the forgotten thousands who never made it home from the end of the war. Subscribe to the channel, turn on your notifications, and keep exploring the dark, unfiltered, and deeply human truths of history that the textbooks are too afraid to print. I will see you in the next one.